Dawn broke cold and gray over Berlin on September 1st, 1939. Fog drifted between the ornate stone pillars of the Abwehr headquarters on Tirpitzufer. Inside a dark paneled office filled with cigarette smoke, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the city pivot into war. Germany's invasion of Poland had begun just hours earlier, and across the capital, bells, radio broadcasts, and crowds proclaimed triumph. But behind the Admiral's tired eyes there was no celebration, no euphoria, only dread. To the world, Canaris was Reichsadmiral Wilhelm Franz Canaris, chief of German military intelligence, personal friend of many top officers, loyal servant of the fatherland. But beneath that polished facade stood a man who had already reached his conclusion, a conclusion that no one in the Nazi high command wanted to hear. Germany would lose the war, not eventually, not possibly, but inevitably. He had tried to warn them, and he would keep trying, even as the machine he served devoured everything in its path.
Years before tanks rolled into Poland, Canaris had studied foreign industrial reports, trade data, energy reserves, and technical capabilities across Europe, the Soviet Union, and the United States. As head of the Abwehr, he received daily intelligence briefings from agents scattered across continents, informants inside embassies, and naval attachés embedded in foreign capitals. What he saw horrified him. America's industrial output dwarfed Germany's by a scale the Nazi leadership refused to acknowledge. Shipyards in California and Virginia that could produce more tonnage in a month than German yards could complete in a year. Steel mills in Pittsburgh that operated day and night. Oil refineries in Texas processing millions of barrels. Factories in Detroit converting assembly lines with staggering efficiency. Even before the U.S. entered the conflict, their economy could outbuild and outlast any European power. Germany simply did not have enough raw materials, oil reserves, manufacturing infrastructure, or long-term supply capability to sustain a modern total war. Not against the U.S., not against the British Empire, certainly not against both. Hitler dismissed such concerns as defeatism, but Canaris had seen this movie before. Because Canaris himself had fought in the previous World War, and he knew how fragile victory could be. A single miscalculation, a single assumption, a single logistical error could doom a nation, and the Nazis were making all three daily. Inside the command structure, Canaris kept his objections quiet and carefully phrased. He had to. After all, many of his counterparts, men like Himmler, Goebbels, were not simply political rivals. They were ideological fanatics who saw dissent as treason punishable by death. And the Gestapo was everywhere. Yet quietly, deliberately, Canaris began whispering warnings to those who would listen. If Germany fought the United States, he argued, it would be a war of attrition. Germany could not win. If Hitler continued alienating traditional military leaders, Germany would fracture from within. If Germany expanded too rapidly, supply lines would collapse in winter. But the more he spoke, the more he was ignored, and the louder the drums of conquest became. Canaris's position was unique. He was one of the few men in the upper levels who had both access to global intelligence and the capacity to analyze it rationally. He had visited the United States in the 1930s as a naval officer and observed firsthand its industrial might. He saw factories stretching across city blocks, entire train yards of locomotives, massive rivers of oil flowing from Texas fields. He bitterly recalled a private conversation where he once told a fellow admiral, "A war against America would be suicide." To others, he warned that the Americans can outproduce any nation in history. This is not a question, it is mathematics. But Hitler didn't care about mathematics. He cared about ideology, momentum, myth, and anyone who contradicted that myth was an enemy. He slowed intelligence operations whenever possible. He issued vague warnings that confused Nazi planners. He shielded officers who opposed Hitler. He passed information to opposition groups. He fed false assessments to certain ministries to delay aggressive plans. He did this carefully, too carefully, for most people to even notice. But a few understood, and they kept their distance. As German soldiers marched into Warsaw and flags flew over public buildings, the Reich celebrated its unstoppable rise. Canaris, however, spent that morning in silence. Sitting at his desk, a small leather notebook open before him. He wrote only 5 words: too fast, too wide, disaster. His warnings intensified as Germany prepared for invasions of France, Belgium, and the Low Countries. Nazi leaders believed speed and willpower could compensate for lack of resources. Canaris knew otherwise. His own informants inside the British Admiralty had already sent astonishing reports. Britain had cracked down on German intelligence networks before the war even began. Ermine espionage in the US was being dismantled piece by piece. American shipyards were expanding even during peacetime. These were not good signs. And yet, inside the Führer's circle, no one wanted to hear it. Germany was winning too quickly. Blinded by early victories, Hitler believed he was untouchable. Generals praised him. Crowds worshipped him. Newspapers declared destiny. But destiny, Canaris understood, was shaped not by ideology or charisma, but by logistics, steel, oil, and the cold arithmetic of attrition. And the arithmetic looked fatal. Around him, a small circle of military officials began to suspect the truth. General Beck, Hans Oster, even some members of the Foreign Office. They shared Canaris's fear and recognized the danger. But they lacked his access, his insight, and his ability to act outside Hitler's immediate control. So they waited, and they watched the Abwehr chief maneuver carefully, weaving a silent net of obstruction under the noses of the most murderous political machinery ever created. They would all eventually pay for it, but not yet. Because in early 1940, the war still seemed young, still seemed winnable, still seemed unstoppable. And that, Canaris knew, was the most dangerous illusion of all. When U.S. intelligence reports began hinting at potential American rearmament, Canaris compared production figures: tanks, steel, oil, aviation fuel, machine tools, everything that mattered. The numbers were terrifying. The United States produced more oil in 1 month than Germany could refine in a year. The U.S. aircraft industry was expanding at a rate no European nation could match. Even the automotive industry, civilian in peace, militarizable in war, was a sleeping giant. To Canaris, this war was already lost long before the first German soldier stepped into Poland. He tried one last time to warn Berlin. He was told to keep his opinions to himself. By the early months of 1940, Canaris found himself drowning in reports. Fresh, accurate, alarming reports. His agents across Europe sent detailed warnings that Nazi leadership refused to even read, much less understand. He watched war plans accelerate at a pace he couldn't slow. He watched Hitler override cautious generals and barrel into decisions that violated every principle Canaris had ever learned as a naval strategist. And above all, he watched the reckless belief that speed equaled invincibility spread through the corridors of power like an infection.
Germany's early victories in Poland had convinced Hitler that his intuition was superior to any data. Canaris's intelligence estimates were treated not as valuable insights, but as obstacles to ideological purity. Hitler began describing intelligence officers as cowards afraid to act. And in the background, Himmler's SS were growing hungrier for control. The Abwehr chief understood this shift for what it was: the death of rational decision-making. It terrified him. When France collapsed in just 6 weeks, Hitler's ego grew immeasurably. It was the greatest victory in modern German military history and the most dangerous moment for the Reich's future. Instead of recognizing the role of luck, poor Allied coordination, and effective armored tactics, Hitler saw divine validation of every reckless instinct. But Canaris saw through the triumph. He studied German casualty reports. He tracked fuel expenditure. He analyzed ammunition usage. He monitored aircraft losses per sortie. What he found was not a sign of invincibility, but vulnerability. France had not been defeated through German superiority of resources. It had been defeated through surprise, maneuver, and the enemy's fragmented response. And surprise doesn't scale. France is not America, he told a colleague. This war has only just begun, and the worst is ahead. He sent a formal memorandum warning that Germany lacked long-term industrial depth for global warfare. The report was ignored. Goering laughed at it.